as we all ought to know, in 2014, Scotland had a referendum on whether it would remain part of the UK or whether it would go down the independent route. And it lost that vote at 45% for independence and 55% for remaining in the UK. But what if that had gone differently? That's what we're going to look into this video. So first of all, we're going to dive into some of the fundamentals in terms of like the economic situation within Scotland. Then we're going to be looking at how independence would have affected not just Scotland but also the rest of the UK. And then also we're going to be looking at current opinion polls and what the situation is at the moment. And so we're just going to dive straight in. So it's something to note that Scotland makes up 8% of the UK's population but contributes 7% of its GDP. It's also something to note that London itself has a GDP twice the size of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland combined. So just give you an idea of just how dominant like England is. Yeah, like England is almost 80% of the economy of the UK and almost 80% of the GDP of the UK. And England gives far more like to the different constituent nations, than it receives in return. So in 2017 to 2018, Scotland per head had a net fiscal deficit of £2,442. So that means that the average Scottish person was receiving on average £2,000 more than they were putting into the UK coffers, right? So, and you see a similar picture for Wales as well. For Wales, it's almost 4,000 per head. And in Northern Ireland, it's almost 5,000 per head. So as a whole, the different constituent nations within the UK are incredibly dependent on England, right? And if you want to really drill into the data even more, you see that of the different regions / nations of the UK, London, the southeast and the east of England are the only regions that contribute more than they receive, so they're the only ones who are net donors, whereas every other region / nation is a net recipient of UK funds. So does that mean necessarily that Scotland would be broke? No, although if we drill into some of this, like we kind of see like just how much they do receive. So England, as with nearly all countries in the world, unfortunately, has a budget deficit. So in 2018, England had a budget deficit of £5.6 billion, which isn't actually like a great deal, especially when you consider that the economy of England is £1.8 trillion. So this represents a figure of 0.3%. However, when it comes to Scotland, we see that they have a total GDP of 168 billion, but the amount that they receive as a net recipient of the UK government, they receive on average 13.3 billion, right? So this represents almost 8% of their entire GDP is money given to them by the British government. What about the situation for Wales? Well, for Wales, we can see that it's 13.7 billion out of a total Welsh GDP of 75 billion. So this represents about 18% of their total GDP. And for Northern Ireland, they receive 9.2 billion out of a total GDP of 56 billion. So this represents 16% of Northern Irish spending. So when we look at it, any country that wants to leave the UK is going to be short of some money, right? Well, with the exception of England, which will obviously be at the gain of quite a few billion. But, in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't make that much of a difference to the English economy. But how much of an effect would it really have on the economy of Scotland? Well, it's not to say that they wouldn't be successful. It's not to say that suddenly they've been plunged into poverty. However, some of the instability from them leaving would certainly, it would certainly affect them, at least in the short term. So, most notably of all is the fact that the UK government has said that, unlike in the case for Ireland, so when the Republic of Ireland left the UK in 1922, from 1922 until 1978, the Irish used the British pound. So this was money controlled directly from the Bank of England, and so they didn't have their own currency as such. They had like a kind of version of it, but mainly it was determined from London, right? So even though they had independence, they still held on to the British pound. But the British government, both at the time of the referendum and since, have said that an independent Scotland would not be able to maintain this monetary union with the rest of the UK. So Scotland would then have to either negotiate with the UK, which given that the UK, relies on Scotland with regard to holding its Trident nuclear submarines. So these are nuclear submarines which we use as a kind of nuclear deterrent, but because they're all submarine based and the ports in Scotland are the only ones that have the facilities to really house it, it would be quite difficult for them to move to England or to other places in the Union. So, so maybe they could kind of do a deal where they could say, yeah, you keep like our Trident bases and then we'll allow you to keep the pound or something like that. But if there's no negotiation, then Scotland would either have to create its own currency or it would have to join the euro, which in spite of how strongly Scotland voted like for remaining in the EU, a lot of people in Scotland do not want to have the euro because obviously they've seen the effect that it's had in many places on the continent. So this would put Scotland in a very awkward position because, first of all, they'd be liable to pay off the debt which is still owed to them as they were under the British, and there'd be less money for pensions. It'd be in the first few years there would be a lot of economic issues because a lot of things would have to be negotiated. Like you'd see a lot of instability in this time, and this would really hurt like kind of Scottish business in the short term. Not to say that long term Scotland would like be a wastebasket and stuff. Of course, like Scotland would do very well as a small country and stuff. But that is something to note, that the first few years of this would be very difficult. And for those of us who have lived through the Brexit Civil War, which is like a video I'm going to do at some point, like documenting the history of like all the goings on of like Brexit from like 2014 to the present, and so definitely check out for that. But like that's going to be nothing in comparison to like how difficult the negotiations are going to be between London and Edinburgh if Scotland ever vote for its independence. Also add to this as well the fact that the EU, as much as Scotland is, it voted 62%, to remain in the EU. So as Europhilic as Scotland is, the rest of the EU is not going to be as happy to admit them into the Union. And this is mainly because, in particular, Belgium and Spain have their own separatist movements, In particular, Flanders, which wants to split away from the rest of Belgium, and Catalonia, which wants to split away from the rest of Spain. And actually, there's a much stronger argument, I'd say, for Catalonian independence than there is for Scottish independence, because Catalonia, unlike Scotland, is a net contributor to the Spanish economy, whereas Scotland is a net recipient. But that being said, like to admit any new country into the EU, it requires the unanimous approval of all states. So if Scotland wanted to be part of the EU, all it would take is for Spain to say no, and then they wouldn't be able to. So does this mean that Scotland would this mean that they'd be kind of out on a limb? Well, not necessarily. They could join EFTA, which is the European Free Trade Agreement, which Norway is part of, Iceland is part of, Switzerland is part of as well. It's quite a good compromise. So they still would be within the single market, and they still would have a certain level of like freedom of movement. They'd be part of Schengen zone potentially. Although then again, the Republic of Ireland isn't part of the Schengen zone, so Scotland could potentially have an opt out for that. So they still have freedom of movement within the EU, but they just wouldn't be part of the EU customs union, well, unless they chose to kind of be part of that as well, which most likely they would. But Scotland, upon getting independence, would have to spend many years negotiating with Britain, but then also simultaneously, if it wanted to, would have to spend many years also negotiating with the EU to try and join that union. So Scotland becoming independent is not necessarily a straightforward thing. The process in the long and the short of it would probably take, Brexit dragged out for many, many years. I think Scotland, for it to kind of gain its full independence and then to be readmitted into the EU, probably talking a period of probably at least, I'd say maybe 3 years, maybe 2, but I think probably 3, 4, maybe 5 years, maybe. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. And also another thing to bear in mind as well is that Scotland, just like Northern Ireland, is heavily dependent on exports to the UK. So 63% of Scottish exports go to the rest of the UK. And then also a similar situation for Northern Ireland as well. So 60% of their exports go to the rest of the UK. So if Scotland leaves, then the argument for Irish reunification is a lot stronger. But then at the same time, it's also still in that transitionary period, there is a fact of there'd have to be different tariff arrangements. There have to be different, like different changes to like kind of freedom of movement across the places as well. Yeah, and in the short term, at least, the level of exports and imports between Scotland and well, basically England and Wales at that point would be very fraught, basically. And yeah, so it's not as easy as simply just saying we're independent and then just going off like into the sunset. It's a little bit more complicated. It's not to say that Scotland should not be independent. It's not to say that they couldn't be independent. It's not to say that they'd be dead broke if they were, but it's not going to be a straightforward thing, and there are some things that you have to bear in mind in that process.